Asia today sits at the crossroads of economic integration, strategic rivalry, and powerful identity politics. These forces overlap, reinforce one another, and sometimes collide. This episode explains how the region arrived at its current complexity, why cooperation and competition run in parallel, and what makes Asia's order both deeply connected and inherently fragile. Asia's modern landscape is the product of successive transformations. For centuries, imperial China shaped regional norms, institutions, and expectations. Southeast Asia adopted many of these structures, while Japan developed its own distinct system. The 19th century then accelerated everything. Japan's early modernization, especially telegraph lines and new transport networks, collapsed distances across East Asia and laid early foundations for regional integration. Colonial rule reconfigured production, law, and infrastructure. Much of that architecture survived empire and shaped how newly independent states fit into the early post-war environment. Japan's defeat in 1945 cleared space for a US-led Pacific system built on alliances, basing access, and large-scale economic assistance. The Cold War in Asia took on its own form. After Mao's victory in 1949, the region was never a simple East-West mirror. Sino Soviet rivalry, US hub-and-spoke alliances, and diverse regional interests created a distinct Asian bipolarity. The post-Cold War era shifted the region again. Liberalization, lower transport and communication costs, and global supply chains deepened economic interdependence. China's WTO entry in 2001 was decisive. It embedded China in global markets and made it central to Asia's production networks. As China's economic weight grew, so did its military and technological capabilities. An expanding People's Liberation Army Navy, a more active Coast Guard and maritime militia, area denial systems, and growing cyber and space power. These developments reshaped how states viewed risks and opportunities, layering strategic competition onto an already integrated regional economy. The result is the contemporary post-Cold War order that consists of dense economic ties, contested security landscapes, and identity politics that influence how states interpret both. The region's economic interdependence rests on long-running structural foundations. Early Japanese telegraph networks created the first regional information infrastructure. Over decades, that evolved into today's highly interconnected production networks, semiconductors, auto parts, shipping, and rare earth supply chains spanning multiple economies. This interdependence stabilizes the region by creating shared commercial incentives, but it also generates vulnerabilities, highly concentrated dependencies, and the ability for states to use trade, investment, and market access as tools of pressure. Economic ties both bind and expose. In 1941, the U.S. defensive line in the Pacific was anchored at Hawaii. After the Second World War, that line extended dramatically, stretching from Japan in the north through the Philippines and down to Australia. This forward posture, backed by alliances and bases, became the foundation of America's regional security architecture. Post-1945 security arrangements, anchored by U.S. alliances and basing access, structured how states approached risk and military planning. China's rise and modernization have since reshaped this architecture. China's expanding economic weight now underpins its ability to project power, with resources increasingly convertible into military strength. China's growing economic weight now anchors its capacity to project power, with wealth increasingly translatable into military strength. What was once promoted as a peaceful rise has evolved into a strategy marked by geo-economic leverage, island building, and confrontations in the South China Sea that unsettle regional neighbors. Both the West and China's immediate neighbors often view these actions as coercive. Beijing, however, frames them as efforts to secure strategic space against what it perceives as U.S. encirclement along the first island chain. Under Xi Jinping, a more centralized, authoritarian, and nationalist leadership style has amplified external anxieties while deepening China's own sense of urgency. These shifts interact with legacy alignments. Allies adjust, neutral states hedge, and gray zone operations introduce ambiguity that complicates crisis management. Asia's security environment is now characterized by high capability, high proximity, and low trust. Identity in Asia is layered with history and memory. Japan's early modern expansion and wartime nationalism left scars that continue to shape sovereignty debates, public attitudes, and even textbook controversies. These legacies are not just about the past, they remain active reference points in how neighbors interpret Japan's role today. At the same time, China's emerging nationalism underpins its rise. What was once framed as rejuvenation now carries sharper tones of pride and grievance, mixing economic ascent with historical narratives of humiliation and revival. This nationalism interacts uneasily with Japan's legacy, creating a rivalry that is as much about identity as it is about power. Across the region, fault lines of ethnicity, religion, and colonial experience add further complexity. From South Asia's sectarian divides to Southeast Asia's plural societies, identity politics magnify disputes that might otherwise appear technical. Territorial disagreements, maritime incidents, or trade frictions resonate because they touch deep cultural and historical nerves. The result is that domestic sentiment becomes inseparable from foreign policy. Shifts in public mood, whether sparked by nationalist rhetoric, historical anniversaries, or perceived slights, can change the temperature of bilateral relations overnight, making Asia's diplomacy as much about managing memory as managing power. Economic interdependence, security dynamics, and identity politics do not operate on separate tracks, they reinforce one another. Early technological integration created new economic patterns, which shaped security thinking and became embedded in political narratives. The same coupling exists today. Deep market ties encourage restraint, military modernization elevates anxiety. Identity politics harden public attitudes and limit diplomatic flexibility. This interconnectedness explains why Asia can be simultaneously integrated and brittle, why countries can trade at scale yet enter prolonged diplomatic freezes over maritime incidents or historical disputes. Asia tends to move between two broad patterns. A virtuous cycle occurs when economic interdependence keeps tensions manageable, encourages communication, and builds habits of cooperation. Stability reinforces itself. A vicious circle forms when shocks, near collisions at sea, trade restrictions, domestic political shifts, are interpreted through nationalist or historical narratives. Escalation then becomes easier, institutions are sidelined, and economic ties weaken. This produces a self-reinforcing loop of mistrust. Transitions between these cycles often hinge on specific events, such as a maritime encounter, a unilateral territorial action, a disruption to a critical supply chain, or even a nationalistic comment by a prominent member of society. Moments like these can flip the system from cooperation to confrontation faster than expected. Asia's order is shaped by contradiction. Deep economic connectivity alongside hardened political narratives, sophisticated institutions alongside recurrent mistrust, rapid technological change layered over unresolved historical tensions. Structural forces, demographics, geography, trade, provide continuity, but sudden shocks can redefine expectations and alter regional trajectories almost overnight. Understanding Asia requires holding those contradictions together. The region is both integrated and contested, stabilizing and volatile, predictable in its long-term trends, yet vulnerable to sharp inflection points. This series will break down these dynamics in detail, highlighting which trends matter, where the biggest risks are concentrated, and how the region's historical layers continue to shape the emerging Asian order. Subscribe to follow the next episodes as they release.